Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to open our event on the European Parliament elections and their significance to Israel. And we would begin with Vice President of the Tel Aviv University, Professor Raanan Rein, please.
Thank you very much, Maya. Shalom. Good afternoon. I take great pleasure in welcoming you all to this round-table discussion on the results of the European Parliament elections. We are fortunate to have here the ambassador of the EU as well as senior diplomats from the Israeli Foreign Ministry. I guess that when this event was originally planned, nobody expected us to be at the beginning of yet another election campaign. But this discussion will be devoted mostly to European affairs and not necessarily to our own issues and challenges. Democracy nowadays, as you all know, is probably going through its worst crisis since the 1930s. A close look at the contemporary international scene reveals that the number of countries that we can describe as democracies is shrinking. Strong men are in power in several countries that once looked as if they were at the beginning of a process of democratization, notably Russia and Turkey. The United States, considered by many as the engine of democracy in the post-World War, has a president who had refused to say whether he would accept the result of the election if it went against him. And I'm not talking about South America, especially the Brazilian case, or very many other countries. At the same time, we see the rise of the so-called populist movements, which, at least in Europe, are in most cases right-wing extremist parties characterized by xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and at times homophobia as well. Populist parties, populist leaders might have different characters depending on the time period, the political context, be it in Europe, the US, or South America. Still, they have several things in common, especially the way they look at the world in a Manichaean world, as if it's a constant struggle between the utmost good and the utmost evil, and as if they are speaking on behalf of the entire people and not representing only part of the people. And all too often, their policies are characterized by an attack on the democratic institutions. If we look at Europe, by now we have this kind of populist movements in each and every parliament of the continent. Until a few months ago, we could say, with the exception of Spain, not anymore. By now, Spain also has its own right-wing populist party, Vox, which started in southern Spain, in Andalusia, and by now is a legitimate actor in the national parliament, in the Cortes. 2.5 million Spaniards voted for Vox. So for those of us who tended to believe that Spain was immune to this kind of parties due to 40 years of Francoist dictatorship, not anymore. So I know that many of us feared worst results of the recent European elections, but still populist parties have gained strength, at least in various European countries, and this is a challenge that we all have to face, either here in Israel or in each and every European country. Tel Aviv University is a leading research institution, is a hub for innovation and entrepreneurship, but it also sees as its mission the defense of certain values like pluralism, tolerance, and solidarity. And in this sense, we do take an active part in our own Kulturkampf, in our own struggle over the main characteristics of Israeli society. I would like to thank the organizers of this event. There are 4 institutions behind this event. First and foremost, our own School of Political Science, Government and International Relations, the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, Mitvim, and the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration. I never remember the initials. And thank you, Maya, for moderating this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Rein. I'm very glad, I was very glad to see the interest, I think rising interest in Israeli media regarding the European Parliament elections. And when Nimrod, Goren, the head of Mitvim, and I, when we were thinking about this event, we were thinking that we're already going to have a government in Israel, and then we can evaluate the results of the European Parliament vis-a-vis the results in Israel. But of course, life are full with surprises, and we may see a change after 17th of September, I believe it is. Still, I think the debate here would be interesting. A couple of months ago, the polls trying to estimate the results in the European Parliament, the results or the polls indicated that the populist, perhaps extreme right-wing political parties would gain more than they did in the elections. So we will probably hear a lot about this issue. That has a big relevance to our debate. And I think one of the more noticeable things about the elections for the European Parliament was the increase in the voting turnout. That increased from 43% in the last elections to above 50%, 50.5%. And this is the highest that has been in the last 2 decades. And I think this also is an indication for the politicization of Europe, the politicization of the topic. And it comes with the politicization as a Eurosceptic phenomena of criticism about the European integration process. But it also, I think the last elections also shows, and this is of course my take, and we can hear other opinions, we do see a rise also of citizens in the European Union coming to defend the idea of integration and actually wanting to strengthen the integration process. And we will see shortly, Omer will present to us the results of the Greens and the Liberals in those elections. And the politicization of the European integration process is a long-going phenomena since the 1990s. And definitely the last decade, with all of the crises that European integration has gone through, with the debt crisis, immigration crisis, rise of terrorism attacks in Europe, rise of populist extreme right-wing parties, and Brexit altogether made the whole debate much more live, interesting, and very relevant to the life of the citizens in the European Union. And one of those crisis, Brexit, has actually had a positive influence on the support of European citizens of their country membership in the European Union. We see the levels of support, according to the Eurobarometer, rising to above 60%. And again, this is a level that the European Union has only seen in the 1990s. So definitely this is a very very interesting topic with significance to Israel. And this is the purpose of the event. So it is the first event that the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration is holding with Mitvim, and I hope others would come. And we had quite a few years of cooperation with the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, very fruitful one. So together we are partners for the wish to increase the knowledge and understanding about European Union in Israel and to see how one can influence the other. And this is the same purpose of the European Studies program here in Tel Aviv University, which is in the School of Political Science and International Relations that Dr. Tal Sadeh is heading. We wish to inform students, our students, some of them are sitting here, about those topics. So this is our common interest of all our partners. So I wish us fruitful event, and we begin with Omer Gendler from the Open University to tell us about the results themselves and to analyze them.
Okay, so I don't have a lot of time, so I guess most of you know the result of the election, but I will say a few points of them, and then we try to break down some of the things that happened. So basically, this is the new European Parliament. You can see here the parties that won the votes. If you want to see the change, so this is a change. This is what change in the Parliament. You can see the biggest winners are the Liberals, some of the Eurosceptic parties, and the Green ones. And this is something that, when I see the Israeli news, it's very confusing because most of Israeli journalists tell us that the winner of the election was the Eurosceptic parties and the Green. And you can see that the winner of the European Parliament election was the Liberals. I think this problem is because most of Israeli correspondents in Europe are based in London and Berlin, and they only see Europe as what happened in Germany and what happened in the UK. They don't see the entire picture of Europe. So this is why I think because the Greens won in Germany, this is what happened all across Europe, and because the Brexit Party won in the UK, this is what happened. But basically, it's not what happened. The Liberals are the biggest victory, and of course, there is some other minor party that won more votes. And the biggest loser, of course, are the EPP and the Social Democrats. It's lost the majority in the parliament. This is another way to see the result of the election. I don't love this map so much because it only shows us who is the biggest party in each country. It's not saying who is the majority in each country, but it's saying who is the biggest party and who is the biggest party in each country. And you can see that in most of Central Europe and East Europe, the EPP won. EPP has most of the seats in Central Europe and in Eastern Europe. France and Italy with Le Pen and Salvini, the Eurosceptic parties, or the Populist Party, or in the New Right, call them whatever you want. And the SD only won Spain and Portugal only in this part of Europe.
This map only shows the first party.
Yeah, not the majority, only the first party.
And then Macron came just a little bit.
Yeah, of course. I said I don't love this map so much. Only to show us who won if you say the first place. Okay, so now we know what was the result. Let's take 4 points that I want to talk about in the 5 minutes I have, and see what I see from these points. The first one was the surprise that most of us saw with the EPP and the Social Democrats. A lot of people said the loss of the majority was a surprise for them. How happened that these two establishment parties lost their support? But I don't understand why they are so surprised, because there is not something new here. It's a process. If you see the result from 2004 to now, from every election, the two parties of the establishment lost some of their support. It's not something that started today in 2019. It's something a long time ago. So if you look at the result in this eyes, you can see that it's not something that now it's at the beginning of it, but it's a process that maybe will continue throughout the years. More new parties, more other movements, and less establishment one that was in the beginning of the European Union. What is more important to see, if we take only the 4 biggest countries in Europe, Germany, Italy, the UK, and France, you can see there, the EPP and the Social Democrats gain their less votes. Basically, most of now the support to the EPP and the Social Democrats don't come from the 4 biggest countries of Europe. They are coming from Central Europe, from the Northern Europe, but not for these 4 countries. You can see in the UK only 14%, of course, because there is no EPP in the UK. And also in France and Italy, only 18% and 36%. So you can see that when we saw earlier that the EPP and the SD got 44%, they got something like 50%, 60% in the tiny countries or in the small countries, but only this percent in the big ones. And if we say that the European Union is still leading by the big countries or the biggest country of the member union. So you can see that there's a more problem in these countries for this establishment party. The other thing is to see that in 3 of the 4 biggest countries, the new right or the Eurosceptic parties have won. So basically, in 3 of the 4 leaders of Europe, you can see now that in the first place we see Salvini, Le Pen, and Nigel Farage. So it's also a way to see that in the biggest countries there is the most Eurosceptic phenomenon against the European Union. And something to add to that, in France and in the UK, this is anti-government election because this is against what happened in Theresa May, and this is against Macron. This is the only country of the big 4 that the government won. The Eurosceptic government won the election, basically. So when we see this as an anti-establishment party or anti-establishment vote, it's not really anymore because this is the government, and the government won Italy. So this is the only difference between the 4 countries about their first place. Another thing to see, it's because the liberal won most of the gained most of the votes, and also the Greens. You can see now that Europe, although we say that the Eurosceptic gained votes, you can say now that also because of the liberal and the Green are much more pro-European than, let's say, the EPP and the Social Democrat, and the liberals in some kind always say about an ever closer union. So in some kind of effect, you can see that Europe as a whole is more connected in this pattern of votes because more pro-European parties will now be part of the coalition or part of the establishment. But if you look inside the countries, you can see there is more and more divide. This is the result map from Germany. So you can see basically the Green Party won most of the cities. The CDU won most of the periphery. And the far right won basically the most parts of Eastern Germany. So you can see that Germany is a divided country now. There is no one region in Germany you can say every one of the parties get 20 or 20 or 5 or in some proportion from what happened. In every region in Germany, there is a unique party that represents the East region, and you cannot see it in the other places. The same thing is happening in the UK. You can see this map. This is something like a rerun of the referendum. The big cities go to the Liberal Democrats. All of England, all of periphery of England, go to the Brexit Party. And the SNP, that is now the Green Party in the UK, the SNP is part of the Green coalition. The SNP is going to Scotland. So you can see also now the UK is a divided country. You cannot see almost any votes for the Brexit Party in Scotland. You cannot see almost every vote to the Green or the Liberal Democrat in part of the periphery of England. So every region is very, very different and unique from the others. Another map that I love is a map of Poland. You can see the East voted for the Eurosceptic party, and the West voted for the pro-European party. So Poland is basically divided between those who want more Europe and are living mostly in the West, in the part that border Germany, and the eastern part of Poland, the Eurosceptic part, getting all the region except the capital city, except Warsaw. Okay, the last point that I want to add, it's about the Brexit. What will happen after the Brexit? Because the UK have a very different pattern of voting than the other countries in Europe. Let's say tomorrow the UK is withdraw from the European Union. What's going to all of its votes? The Liberal, the Greens, the SD, and the ECR are the biggest losers from Brexit withdrawal. So basically now the EPP, in some way of a catch, need the UK to withdraw from the European Union to strengthen coalition in the parliament. So this is something that is very troubling, because from some point they want more to see a more pro-European version of the UK, or want to show that they want the UK inside. But if you look at the votes, they are the one who gain most of the UK withdrawal. So the EPP are now, and exceptly if they are going to now have the problem with who's going to be in the commission, if it will be Weber or Bonnier. So maybe now the EPP will gain a more stronger position against the UK, just to put it out and get its strong coalition stronghold and its strong ability to form the next coalition and be decided who will be the next commission. So I will end with that, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Omer. And we are moving to Noga Arbel, who is a senior analyst at what we call in Hebrew the MAMAD, המרכז למחקר מדיני, at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I would maybe perhaps stress that Noga is not a diplomat, she is an analyst.
And that is true on many, many levels. But the important one for this discussion is that whilst I specialize in Europe and I do try to offer an analysis of the situation, I do not speak for the ministry. That's on the other side of the table right there. And since, well, that was my first disclaimer. I have a few, but that was the bureaucratic one. We've been asked to talk about implications to Europe. And there are a few disclaimers when you speak of the European Parliament this close to the election results that need to be made. The first one is that while the Parliament has gained strength from Lisbon and everything that came after, it still is a very different kind of parliament with a few levels of analysis that need to be explained. And it's I guess its leverages are limited, and that is something its leverage on Europe and on European reality is limited, and that's something to remember when we discuss implications for Europe. We also need to remember, as we just learned here, that the question isn't just what the results are, but it's also what you do with them. And much like all democracies, the change in political climate and the change in the ability to compromise, which we'll get to in a minute, is also changing the ability to translate whatever the results were into concrete political reality. And before we know how that translation happens, everything that we say should be taken with a very, very large grain of salt. And the third disclaimer, again, has to do really with the nature of any Western political system. There are a lot of newcomers to the specific, first of all, there are a lot of newcomers to this specific system. They don't know the rules, not the written ones, because there are just too many of them to read, but also not the unwritten ones. And the reality today is a very close Twitter-based, Facebook-based connection between people and their voters. So their ability to compromise and their need to show a political backbone make it so that you won't necessarily want to play nice with the other kids. And when remembering that, we understand that with the complications that come with a more fragmented parliament, we're also going to see a lot less compromise. And so translating the results into a concrete reality is going to be more difficult, not just in the formation of the new political groups, but also with their actual use, quote unquote. משמעת סיעתית? Coalition discipline, which wasn't that good to begin with, is going to be that much harder to attain. And even in the previous parliament, we saw a lot of votes that went along national lines and national interest rather than political and party ones. So using the additional power Parliament has received in the last decade is going to be more difficult. And so everything that I'm about to say from now on should be taken with all of those disclaimers in mind. Another thing that I'm going to want to add to it is a level that we're not used to discussing usually when discussing elections, and this is where we're getting to the analysis part, which is the level of states. And Omer touched on it when he was talking about the representation of governments. And what I'm going to try to do is I have a few 3 sections of analysis, and to each of them I'm going to try also to add that one, because we need to understand that whilst the idea of the European Parliament is a, I guess, more direct level of democracy between the people and the European Union, the states are in fact a large player in it. And so the way that the results are translated also affects the weight of each state in a way that we're not necessarily used to seeing. So let's talk about general trends, which is all we can say at this point. Seriously? Wow, that was... no, that went fast, and we're just getting started. Okay. The European system is frozen every 5 years. It does not, it doesn't respond to political changes. You get a picture. So what we're seeing now is a 5-year catch-up between a system that continued to become fragmented and the political system that it is expressed within it. And when we're looking at fragmentation, Omer displayed a right-to-left explanation of the parties, but it is not at all an appropriate description of European political reality, because it is, first of all, we need a lot more than just one axis. And the right-to-left one is actually the least descriptive of European reality. It's not even a center to extreme description, because even though these S&D and EPP lost a lot of their strength, they didn't lose it to the extremes. They actually lost it to different centrist party. They lost it to the Green Party and to the centrist party. So 2 lines that are more descriptive, and you need to take them together, is more and less Europe, and I guess instead of right and left, universalists versus nationalists, or progressives versus conservatives would be better axes to look at. And when you look at these axes, you actually see very little difference between the bodies. If you have EPP, S&D, ALDE, and Green on the more Europe side, and basically everybody else on the other, the change between those 2 groups is 2%. It's like 16 votes. They're still moving it, but the change is more significant when you look within each group. So you see that, again, S&D and EPP lost a lot of their power to the other 2, I guess, to the newcomers. And ECR and GUI, which are, I guess, the ones that we know better, lost a lot of their power to, they're gonna keep changing their names, but no one's gonna argue that they're gonna be the new nationalists that we now know as ENF and EFDD. And those are the much more significant changes that we see. And within this, it's important to remember, and this is where we're getting to the level of the countries in of themselves, S&D and EPP are actually represented in almost every European country, if not all of them. The others are not. The Green Party and ENF are actually sort of mirrors. You will find the Green Party in the north and west, and you will find ENF mostly in the south and east, and they do not coincide. And the other problem with that is that a lot of the times, and this is where we're getting to the crux of the state problem, some governments that are not represented in groups like Macron's representation in ALDE are not represented at all in the decision-making of the group. Because what we're going to have, threw me completely off balance, that thing, but it's an important point to make. Decisions are probably going to be made by a coalition of the more Europe. if only because everybody else is having that much more difficulty getting along, and that first group is more used to it than the others. Unfortunately, that group no longer represents a lot of European governments. Now, some of the change between the old and the new centrists, let's call them that for the sake of abbreviation, just represents a change within the states. The reason why France is now represented by ALDE is because of an actual change in the French system. However, the Italian government and the Greek government do not have a representation within that decision-making group anymore. And so on a national country level, even if they won their national election, their national European election, it will not be expressed in the actual political, well, the foreseen political reality of European Parliament. Okay, one last thing, because I went apparently way over with the level of information I wanted to bring in here. One more important thing: even though the Green and ALDE parties are both enjoying a rise in the number of members, they are actually representing, both of them, a decrease in the number of countries represented in them. So again, what we're seeing is a move toward more fragmented Europe, not just because we have more parties, but also because the states that are represented within the European Union are drifting away from each other, and the overarching ideas that are represented, whilst the European Union might represent more accurately, the European Union as a whole might represent more accurately the political reality, its translation, at least at the moment, doesn't look like it's going to be doing the same thing in terms of the weight that each state or each country is going to have within the European Parliament. And that was it.
Thank you very much. And we are now moving to the more diplomatic side, and to the ambassador to the state of the European Union, obviously, to the state of Israel, Ambassador Emanuele Giaufret, please.
Thank you, Maya. How much time do I have? 10 minutes, okay. All right, so I'll try to give you my personal and institutional vision on these elections, what we can take out of these. I think the first point to make is that the European project is alive and is actually in a good shape. You were saying, Maya, that the support for the European Union, according to Eurobarometer, is high. In fact, it's very high. It's about 86%, which is the highest since 1982, 1983. And in certain countries like Poland, reaches 92, 95% support for membership. So very good result in terms of support in the opinion polls, which has translated in a higher participation in this election. More than 50%. And let's not forget that the participation to the EP elections has been decreasing since 1979. So there's been an inversion of the trend, a very remarkable inversion of the trend, with almost plus 10% in this election compared to 2014. And interestingly, the participation has been going up in all countries, with a few exceptions. In Portugal went down, but there's a question about how they count votes. In Italy went a little bit down, but it has been historically high. But even in the East, where participation has been historically very low, it remains lower than in Western Europe, it went up. So there's a renewed interest in the European project. That's the first point. The second point is true. We had a number of parties that have been advocating a different view of Europe, but no party that has a certain substantial result has been advocating for leaving the European Union. No one. So we have a debate on what Europe is, what's the role of member states, but everyone think and promote the idea that European Union is good for the European citizens. They have to stay, we have to be there, we have to influence the process. So I think this is a big victory that for the project itself. And then thirdly, although there was an idea by President Macron to create transnational parties that didn't fly, mainly the EPP was not supportive of the idea, so we didn't have transnational parties, although we had transnational candidates of certain member states in other country. But nevertheless, there was a dialogue among national forces that took place, and even the most Eurosceptical forces decided to get together and have collective meetings and supporting each other. And I think this is really creating a common European political space, which we don't have yet. It's in the making, and I think this election have been very important in promoting such a space. So, and then fourthly, of course, the results are indicating that the pro-European forces have actually won these elections. The macro figures and what we saw before is an indicative figures, because the parties have to decide in which groups they will sit on the 1st of July. So we'll see some adjustment of the figures that you showed us, but certainly the trend is very clear. The Liberals and the Green came on top. Certainly the two parties that have been dominating the European Parliament since its creation, the EPP and the Social Democrats, are no longer in a position to do so. But in every member state, we've seen the same phenomenon. An erosion of the two main parties in Germany, in Italy, in Spain. In the UK, we haven't seen it because of the election system, but if we go to a European election with a proportional system, we see the results is actually the same. So what we see, the European Parliament is reflecting also a trend which is affecting every member state, which I think make it a faithful reflection of where the Europeans are standing. So this is in terms of results. So I think the European project is alive. Also, we have some indications on what the European voters want from Europe. One of the topics that certainly has taken a lot of attention, more or less, depending on the country, is the question of the rule of law. Let's not forget, for example, in Romania, as they were voting for the European election, they were also voting for a referendum related to the rule of law and the possibility of basically immunity for a number of heads of institutions and ministerial position. So there was an important issue. In other country was also a very important one, I think. And the message in terms of majority that we have out of this Parliament is that rule of law, democracy, human rights remains important values. So the Europeans want to remain loyal to their own identity. And then climate change and environmental issues. I think behind the green surge, there's certainly an interest for Europeans on these issues. And the socialists have been campaigning extremely focusing on this issue as well. So they might not have won, but they have adopted the issues of the green in terms of environment. So these will be issues that will certainly be there. And then we've seen taxation of big companies has become a big issue that has mobilized many citizens, and many leaders have been campaigning on this, how you can ensure a fair and just taxations of business. And then, of course, for the most right-wing parties, this is a question of migration that was certainly very important. How the European Union can protect citizens of Europe. I think this is perhaps something which is an horizontal issue that across the various topics I've touched. Now, what do we do with this? I think the colleague before was rightly mentioning the member states. Europe is not a country, it's a different type of political animal, and we have a dual legitimacy. One is the direct elections of the parliament, which are very important, but there's also the legitimacy coming directly from the government. And now we're in the process of seeing how these two things will interplay. This election was the second one conducted with the famous method of Spitzenkandidaten, meaning that the main parties presented candidates for the Commission presidency. The EPP presented a German, Manfred Weber, the Socialist, Dutch, Timmermans, etc. But we see that without a clear majority, the Spitzenkandidaten method seems to be a little in difficulty. And we saw yesterday the first meeting of the heads of state and government. The idea was directly questioned by Macron. that although he didn't win the elections because Marine Le Pen came up by 0.9% before him, I think in terms of results, in terms of his weight inside the parliament and in the council, he's certainly in a good position to contribute to the decisions of the key position. So we will see in the coming days this interplay between the parliament and the council for the selections of the top jobs, and also, of course, of a platform. We will now need to develop a set of priorities around which the parties in the parliament and the member states will decide on these jobs. The council propose a head of the commission and the parliament elect. So we will have by the 21st of June, which is the date, the council should propose a number of personality for these top jobs, the commission, the council, and the high representative. And by the 14th of July, the parliament should vote. We don't have a deadline as in Israel, so we don't risk fresh elections in a few weeks if we don't succeed. We might have to postpone the entry into force of the new commission, but this is the calendar. So when we see these results, I think we have to think also of the reality of the member states, what is the political forces within the member states, and the two combined will deliver the final result. But I think really the message that came out clearly from this election is that the European project is in a good health, and I think for the first time Europe is instilling passion in the voters. And this is something very new. Europe is no longer something very technocratic, very distant. People are understanding the importance of Europe on their own lives. The criticism, of course, which is totally legitimate to criticize your political institutions, but also support and understanding that Europe needs to be protected because it has delivered peace, prosperity, and cooperation since 1950s in Europe.
Thank you, Maya, and it's good to speak after Ambassador Giaufret and after Noga and Omer, because I think they all portrayed a certain picture, and what we can always say that you cannot argue with facts, but you can certainly analyze them and interpret them in many different ways. So I will try to give from the MFA point of view the more practitioner point of view and on the implications of these elections on Israel. And here we still have to bear in mind that the process hasn't ended yet. I wrote down to myself two certain milestones that we still need to undergo. One is June 24, when all the political groups in the parliament, in the new parliament, will have to be registered. So I think that also the picture that Omer portrayed here, including referring to the numbers of the ENF and the EFDD and perhaps some others, might change in terms of the political grouping and the configuration. It might have also implications on the balance of power in the parliament. And of course the Brexit. If and when, not if, sorry, once the Brits are leaving, the parliament will lose 73 UK MEPs, and of course it will affect also, as Omer demonstrated, the balance of power in the parliament. When it comes to Israel, I think that first and foremost we will perhaps confront or will have to live with or deal with the situation, the new situation, like every other member state in Europe or other third countries in the world. And it has been described here, you know, a new European Parliament which is more fragmented, diversified, perhaps even polarized. This is not only something that Israel will have to deal with. A smaller and weaker center, perhaps not anymore bipartisan, but also with fringes or margins which are also not only bigger, but also certainly would like to dictate the agenda of the new parliament, at least initially. And of course, the phenomena of the new right or the deep right or the populist groups, and also of the Greens. All of them have different agendas, either climate or their own national states first, on the expense of Europe, but also on the expense of perhaps other global agenda. This might also affect Israel, and this might affect Israel also when it comes to trade issues, for example, Horizon Europe, R&D, and other perhaps instruments, mechanism, programs of the EU. So it will not be only Israel, but it will certainly affect Israel among others. Secondly, and again, it was mentioned here also in the running up for the elections. The Eurosceptics, the deep right, the new right, but also the left. I mean, Israel has always maintained an open channel, sometimes critical, with most elements in the European Parliament. You have the extreme left in the parliament, and this is a very interesting thing. You have people who won't be talking to us, mainly the extreme left, in different variations, of course. But there are also, and this should be said, there are also elements in the parliament based on European parties that we do not speak with. For example, only to mention two: the FPO in Austria. And the AfD in Germany, for example. These are two political parties, at least according to the current policy. We don't have any contact on the national or the European level. The third point, which I would like to refer to, and this is because it's a matter of implication on Israel that I've been asked to speak about. But I think that we should also look at what the new formation of the European Parliament might do in a certain scenario, and perhaps to be a little bit, I would say, argumentative, and perhaps to be a little bit kind of more vivid and interesting, I will put it on the extreme. The new Parliament, as I said, might have or will have elements that will have different agendas. Some of them very clearly will not be very much, I would say, pro-Israelis. Okay. The public image of the EU in Israel, and I put it very, I would say very openly here on the table, has not been always very positive. The EU as such, as an entity, didn't always enjoy high rating in the Israeli public, but also in Israeli political circles. And this is something that we should wait and see, for the new parliament, how it will evolve in terms of its, I would say, approach to Israel. Because, for example, if we will begin to see ongoing initiatives by extreme elements who would like to dictate the agenda of the parliament and raising all kinds of resolution moves, etc., referring to Israel, I say, and again, we cannot be certain on this, but still it has to be said that it will affect also, because everything today is very open. Everything is immediately communicated by Twitter, in the newspapers, on TV. It disseminates. If this trend happens, of course, it might affect also the public image of the EU in Israel, but also it might have an effect. And again, I'm saying this also as a practitioner, on the appetite of Israeli political circles or Israeli politicians to advance and the relationship, the bilateral relationship with the EU. So I put this also, not implications only for Israel, but also how such moves or policies by elements, not by the European Parliament as such, but elements in the European Parliament might have also effect on Israeli EU bilateral relations. Thank you.
What about the positive scenario? It's just a negative one? Can we stop the negative?
I think that when we speak of the European Parliament, and again, since I have long experience with the European Parliament, I very much hope to be positively surprised.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, the hosts, for inviting me. Pleasure to be here. I'm going to take a slightly different direction in my short remarks. Number one, I have taken the headline seriously, implications for Israel. So I'm going to talk about, try to draw some parallels between what's going on in Europe and what's going on in Israel, domestically, internationally, and so on. And I'm also going to deviate from the analytical side and offer some prescriptions, policy prescriptions, recommendations, and so on. So superficially, quickly, for the sake of getting your attention, I would point out a few commonalities between what's going on in Israel and what's going on in the EU as a result of the elections. The elections, of course, are just a reflection of deeper trends. I would submit, number one, that voters are moving to the center, but the center is moving to the right. I would also submit that everything is becoming extremely personalized in politics, both here and there. And also that it is becoming more and more fluid. Omer spoke about the rise of new parties. Voter loyalties are not what they were. Old establishment parties are suffering. New forces are rising, but everybody realizes that it's all transitory. I think that if you were to meet the average European politician, let's say somebody that just got elected, and you would ask him, where would you be 5-10 years down the road? A few years ago, the average politician would have said, well, of course, I'm going to still be a politician. I'm going to be in this party, and I'm going to run again, blah, blah, blah. You're not going to get the same response, neither in Europe, obviously not also in Israel, with the extreme short-termism that we just witnessed last night. I would also say that the domestic and external or international dimensions of policy and politics are mixed to a degree that they never were before, both, again, in Europe and in Israel. I'll say a few words later about that. I think voters, by and large, are exhausted and overloaded and confused. We are bombarded by information. The old filters do not work anymore. We do not have new filters, and we are all operating in the infamous echo chambers and Facebook bubbles and so on. So we are in a situation in which there is no established narrative, and there are alternative narratives, and there are alternative facts. And it is becoming increasingly difficult for the average voter and even the above average voter to try and figure out, as we say in Hebrew, mi neged mi. Who's against who, what's going on here. And again, what just happened last night is a very good example. The veterans, the most senior observers, analysts, commentators, when you ask them, okay, help me understand what went on last night, I think very few are in a position to say that they have a clue. And again, I think in Europe there are a lot of parallels to that. So I made a short list. I didn't prepare slides, but I made a short list of the issues that I would encourage everybody to look into while trying to compare Europe and Israel for the purposes of such a discussion and policy recommendations and so on. Number one, it was raised earlier, the turnout. It's very interesting that in Europe the turnout is on the rise. In Israel, it's on decline. And I submit that in the shortly upcoming Israeli elections, it's going to go lower. And it's interesting to note. I already said that I think there's a movement to the right. We can debate maybe later what is right now. I mean, what constitutes right, both here and in Europe. I think the definitions do not hold anymore, but by and large, there is a movement to the right, certainly in Israel and partially also in Europe. Personalization, I spoke about that. Fake news, obviously a huge phenomena, both here and there. Nationalism on the rise here and there. In terms of issues, immigration, obviously a tremendous issue in Europe, a non-issue in Israel. Used to be until a few years ago, it's no longer an issue. Terrorism, more of an issue now in Europe than it is in Israel, paradoxically. Economic issues as a factor in voter participation and so on on the rise in Europe, on the decline in Israel. Climate, complete non-issue in Israel, on the rise in Europe. Relations with the US, obviously in Europe, a major issue on the negative side, in Israel on the positive. With Russia, similarly. It plays a very different role, relations with Russia here and in Europe. So I would say that in terms of the internal dynamics, domestic politics dynamics, there are a lot of similarities between Israel and the EU, and you could argue perhaps that they are moving in somewhat similar directions. However, in terms of foreign policy, they are moving apart. There will be an interesting meeting a few weeks from now here in Israel between the national security advisors of Trump, Putin, and Netanyahu. I would dare you to locate one European capital in which such a meeting can take place. So we are drifting apart. We are, to a large extent, have given up on Europe, and we are closing in, if you will, on the US on the one hand and on Russia on the other. And we are able to, and this is to the credit of Netanyahu, we are able to maneuver, if you will, between those two superpowers at the expense of the EU. When Chancellor Merkel says that the EU should realign itself towards three rivals, Russia, China, and the US, what is the distance between that and naming Israel in the same line? And when the Israeli government calls the EU an anti-Israel element, how long is it going to take for the EU to react? Even though it's usually very slow to react. So what do we do? As I said, I want to be prescriptive as well. First of all, we need to fight for the facts. There, as I said, a tremendous amount of fake news. The filters are gone. It is the responsibility of everybody who has a voice, whichever kind of voice, to fight for the facts. And I say that despite the fact that on the way earlier today on the radio, I heard Lieberman reacting to Netanyahu's accusations and saying that, you know, let's stick to the facts. Yeah, I'm finishing. Number two, let's give credit to the public. One, at least in elite circles, in intellectual circles, in perhaps sometimes liberal or left-wing circles, there is a tendency to say that, you know, the public is stupid. The public is voting against its own interest. I would argue against it. It's not stupid. It's not voting against its interests. It is confused with a lot of justification to being confused. And the public, by and large, understands that the politicians have no answer. So we need to give more voice to the public. We need to upgrade democracy. And here, I would suggest, there is a lot of room for cooperation between Israel and Europe. Because we can learn a lot from Europe about democracy, democratic values, new ways and means of democracy, institutions, and so on. And Israel can bring to the table technology, innovation, and its unique qualities. Also, we need to strengthen institutions. We must fight against the personalization. Not all politics is personal, and not all politics is local. And we need to fight against that. Lastly, we need to strengthen the cooperation between the pro-democracy forces in Israel and Europe. The nationalists are already cooperating. The other side, less so. Thank you.
Dr. Nimrod Goren, head of the Mitvim, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policy. Yes.
Thank you, Maya, and thank you for the partnership and for holding this event together with Mitvim. I will present some observations and a few recommendations for Israel, for Europe, some of which are based on a recent report we published with the German think tank SWP and the Dutch organization PAX, which you have your the abstract in front of you, and some will relate to points that Eran have made. First, in terms of observations, we need to recognize the significant implications for Israel from the European Parliament elections may be known only later on, after the transition period that the European Parliament is currently in, will terminate, the appointment of key position, the President of the Commission, the High Representative. At this point of time, when the European Parliament is transitioning, we expected the Trump plan to be presented. Now we're not so sure anymore. But if that happens within the transition period, the ability of the European Parliament to respond effectively to that plan will be even less than it would have been otherwise. Second, the hopes within the Israeli right that the European far-right actors who are less critical towards Israel policies will be successful in changing the European Union and Parliament from within did not materialize. An alliance between Israel and far-right actors in Europe can only bring limited benefits for Israel and has very significant shortcomings. I think this is clear now and is becoming even clearer more. This is a good development. European projects remain strong after these elections with diversity of parties, of actors, of voices who are supporting it, and with a majority that is strongly committed to liberal democracy and their values. This again is something that should be seen as serving Israel's interest. Specifically, when we look at countries, we can highlight what is happening in Italy. The rise of the far right in Italy in comparison to other countries may be significant for Israel because Italy's involvement in several regional projects, especially Eastern Mediterranean natural gas focused ones, and growing isolationism and marginalization of Italy within the EU structure may lead it to withdraw to a certain extent from these projects in which Israel has clear interest. Finally, on this part, the elections show the effectiveness of get-out-the-vote campaigns. The rise of voter turnout that some of the speakers have already related to showed that participation could be higher than before as Israel heads to another election cycle where there is distrust in the political system by the side of social sectors, when there is calls within the Arab society not to participate. Those in Israel looking for a higher turnout can look into examples from Europe and try to learn relevant lessons. In terms of recommendations, some of those will be focused on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. First and foremost, Israel should view the European Union as a partner and a friend, even if a critical one, rather than a foe. It should stop inciting against the EU and instead share with the public the wide range and depth of cooperation existing between Israel and the European Union on multiple fields. This cooperation is an asset for Israel and should be highlighted to the public. When Israel tries to advance its interest within the European Union through relationship with member states or small grouping of states, it should do so in a way that does not damage Israel-EU relation and does not weaken the EU. Namely, for example, working through pro-democracy, pro-EU countries like Cyprus and Greece, rather than through Eurosceptic and anti-liberal countries or regimes like the ones in the V4 countries. Israel should welcome European involvement in efforts to advance Israeli-Palestinian peace, rather than to try and marginalize the EU and focus only on US mediation. The EU should not replace US mediation, but it can definitely be part of a broader multinational effort to bring progress in the peace process. And Israel should welcome European Union support to pro-peace Israeli civil society organizations and should respond favorably to the European Union's offer to upgrade ties between Israel and the future Palestinian state after and when peace between Israelis and Palestinians is reached. Israeli civil society organizations on their own front should put more emphasis on improving Israel-EU relations. There are very few organizations currently working on that topic. They could do so by forging a content partnership with like-minded European organizations, by bridging knowledge gaps within the Israeli public and political system on EU-related issues, and by raising the relationship between Israel and the EU as an issue in the campaign, as a political issue to be discussed through the lens of democracy and foreign policy and their interlinkage as elections are drawing near. As for recommendations for Europe, the EU should stop waiting for the publication of the Trump plan passively, as we have been seeing over the recent or the last couple of years. This is not likely to happen soon. And while waiting for that, the EU should be more critical of steps taken by the American administration that further peace. We saw criticism of Trump's statements and policies regarding the Golan and Jerusalem, but not so much European voices criticizing steps that have undermined the Palestinian leadership and that cut funding to Israeli-Palestinian joint civil society projects. The EU should reaffirm its commitment and principles of parameters for Israeli-Palestinian peace. the lack of such reaffirmation is being perceived in Israel as less of importance by the EU attributed to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and raises question marks whether the EU still wants to be involved. The EU should also engage in developing new pro-peace initiatives and to find ways to bypass internal divisions that have paralyzed it in recent years when it came to discuss this topic. One option is to advance a new international mechanism together with other partners, and we recently saw statements by the EU and the Arab League on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, a mechanism that will be able to put into fruition the idea of an international incentive package, political, economic incentive for peace, to be presented to Israelis and Palestinians alike. The EU should step up its support for Israeli pro-peace and pro-democracy civil society groups, acknowledging the importance of such groups for increasing positive interactions between Israelis and Palestinians, but also for promoting progressive values. As Eran said, we see populist leaders in Europe, Israel, and the US acting and helping each other towards respective elections, and I think we should see more of that happening on the Liberal Democratic camp. We see some signs of that within the US progressive camp and the recent Macron-Lapid meeting before the previous elections, and I think this partnership should be fostered and promoted.
Thank you very much for a great opening for a discussion, and we can move to the comments, and then you can also, if you would like, you can comment on one another if you haven't done so until now. So I would like to collect a few questions or comments, and you would have to use the microphone so the video recording would hear you.
I have 3 short comments. The first one, I just feel the urge to point it out. That is the role of nationalists in European politics. If the 2nd of July would come and we're thinking about the forming of political groups, I have yet heard a commentator that doubts the fact that ENF, or whatever name they will take, would form a political group. And if we remember, back in 2014, they found it really hard to form a group. I mean, it only took them 2 years to form a political group. So that shows us that nationalism, even though the nationalists have been disregarded by most of the local politics in the local political arena in the European countries, they're not going away. They're here to stay. It's a force that needs to be taken into account. And the other point that I think also needs to be mentioned is the fact that though it is a European elections, they're also very much a local elections. I mean, the local forces within the national countries are still pushing their own agenda within this form. And if we would look, for instance, at the elections in Poland, I mean, almost double the turnout. That's more or less because there was a highly contested local issue that was taken into account. We also see in the parliament members themselves, some of them still look as being a European parliamentarian as a pit stop between going back into their own local national politics. Yet we do seem to have other members of parliament that see that Europe is a career, that seeing themselves as a European parliament member for more an extended period. And so there is still a tension between the local and the European level that is not completely been ironed out within the parliament. And third point that I think that it's also a point and a question is we talk about how this will play out within decision making. It's true, it's still early to say, we haven't seen the political group, but if we'll just take into account that the coalition that will be formed will be within the pro-European parties, there are still very highly contested issues that we've yet to see how they will play out. For instance, I'm just throwing here like a couple of them. The spending on defense is very highly contested among pro-European countries. Should the EU spend more on defense research? And another is the trade relationship with the United States. It's still a very highly contested issue between members within their own political group. So that is another question that will play out. And just throwing the last one, agriculture. I mean, people who follow European politics, the term glyphosate is, if you throw it in a European room, people will go berserk, which is, people who don't know, it's a weed killer. And the use of this weed killer in agriculture is very highly contested within European politics among political groups, between countries within a certain political group. So we have yet to see how the decision making will play out, because Parliament needs to pass laws. And just a reminder, to pass a law through Parliament now takes over a year. So it might take even more than that.
I agree that all politics is domestic. This happens in federal systems too. People vote for their issues in their own towns and regions, even if they vote for a higher office national. So what we see in the map that Omer presented is pretty much a reflection of what goes on in these various member states' politics. And we see that France and Britain are ahead in the shift from a traditional left-right in the Marxist sense alignment into a pro or anti-globalization / integration. And the British political system is being torn apart because of its inflexibility and yet the forceful shift to that. So I think the enthusiasm of many of the right-wingers, what we call the extreme right-wingers, to do the EP elections was that this is a different kind of vote where there are supposedly less consequences for your politics inside. You're not voting for your own parliament, at least in people's mind. We all know that the European Parliament has a lot more force and power than that, but in many people's minds, it's like a cheap vote. It really doesn't, it's not about us, so it allows for, like in Britain, these new parties to rise up and gain a lot. I would caution against reading the election results in terms of the success of the far right, because a known tactic has been for mainstream parties to adopt some of the rhetoric of the far right in order to draw in some of their vote. So I would more rely on text analysis of the way mainstream parties talk to see to what extent they incorporated the right-wing agenda, and in this sense, how forceful these parties really are. In other words, there's a shadow of the far right that far exceeds their electoral gain that we should be thinking about. Finally, as for Israel, I hate to disappoint, it's not about Israel. And I don't think the European Union is going to be very much busy with Israel, other than the technical issues, of course. But in terms of policy, Europe is very busy with some important issues inside, and it doesn't have the time for a process that has disappointed so much in the past. So many initiatives have died here that I just don't think this is going to be a big issue between Israel and the European Union.
In terms of the shadow of the far right, I absolutely agree. And I said, I think the overall, you could depict the results through various lenses and narratives. I would argue, like you, that ultimately we are seeing more and more nationalism, right-wingism, if you will, and again, it's a question of how exactly you define that. Even if it's not necessarily reflected in some of the numbers, and depending on how you analyze the numbers and so on, and I agree with you on that. Regarding the whether or not Israel is an issue for Europe, I agree also. Israel is not obviously a big issue for Europe. What I was trying to say is that if from an Israeli perspective, we have to a large extent given up, quote unquote, on Europe. And it used to be that Europe was much more of an issue for Israel. And again, you could easily build an alternative narrative, like many of us have done, some are still doing, in terms of the real importance of Europe for Israel, obviously economically, but also on security issues, on value-based issues, and so on. So when I say that they're drifting apart, I'm saying it with concern, not with any kind of blessing. I'll stop here.
Thank you. So I will have two quick remarks. First, also to reassure Ambassador Giaufret that I end with an optimistic and an upbeat tone. No, I think that, and again, to comment on what Eran said, I think that to say that Israel has given up on Europe it will be a little bit of overstatement. I think that if you look at many practical elements of cooperation that we have with Europe, be it in tourism, be it in open sky agreements, be it in R&D, be it in trade, in many respects, academy, really the relationship are very deep and very wide. The question is if we can move beyond that and do more. Here we have a problem because of the political circumstances, and this is a two-way street. So it's not that also Israel has given up on Europe. I think it should be also said that Europe perhaps, or some in Europe, not given up on Israel, but certainly see it in a different way from the way they saw it before, but still potential is there and relationships are running very deep and very wide. The second point is whether Israel or not is an issue for Europe. I would argue that it is, not to the extent perhaps that other themes are thematic or geographical, but certainly the positions that Israel take on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, on Iran, and on other regional issues are far-reaching and are beyond the, I would say, the isolated Israeli-EU relationship. And when it comes to Europe and it sees Europe sees it as affects its broader agenda, be it Mediterranean, regional, global, then Israel perhaps is not an issue in itself, but it certainly is certainly takes a place in issues which the EU sees as very important. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Just perhaps to address some of the comments that have been made by focusing on a couple of issues. First of all, I think this election has been a lot about European sovereignty. How you restore European sovereignty from a monetary, financial, security point of view. There is, and what Ms. Merkel has indicated when we look at the US, China and Russia, it's a reflection of our awareness that perhaps we don't have enough instruments to be able to defend our interests vis-à-vis this type of actors. And the issue of defense is certainly something that has developed very much in the last Commission, and I think it will continue to grow in order to restore the sovereignty of the European Union vis-à-vis these actors. Same thing can be said about trade and our financial transactions, the defense of the interests of our company abroad, and the territorial effects of certain decisions that certain members and other countries are taking vis-à-vis us, number one. Number two, the question of the rules-based system, which is linked to the first one. We remain very attached to a system where we set rules within a certain organization, be it the WTO or the United Nations or regional organization, and that these rules are actually implemented. And this is where our interest for the also the conflict with the Palestinians will certainly come up, because it's not only about here, but it's about a more general approach. And we have issues with annexation of territories in our eastern neighborhoods vis-à-vis the Russians. We have one of our member states whose territory is partly occupied by another power. So there is an importance we give to this. This is the European way of doing things, and I think the forces that will most likely be in charge of running the European Union in the coming years will remain extremely interested in upholding these principles. And then the question of protecting the European citizens, which is also linked to this. How you protect them, not only from a security perspective, but also in the way of life and the standard of living. And this is where environment will be very important. Environment, social justice, and fair taxation. I think these certainly will be issues that will be high on the agenda. Now, vis-à-vis Israel, certainly Israel was not a topic of the campaign, a big topic of the campaign, but we remain interlinked. And I see it where I'm sitting every day. When the fires in Modin started, the Israeli government activated the civil protection mechanism that has allowed some member states, namely Italy, Cyprus and Croatia, if I'm not mistaken, to provide support to to Israel. So there was a national effort, but also a European effort. Erasmus, we are in a university. Last year there were more Israeli students going to Europe than anywhere else, including the US. Very interesting development. Tourism, we've mentioned this. Trade, we remain the largest trading partner of Israel, and I don't think this is going to change. Energy, who will consume the gas that Israel will be able to export? The US, China, or Europe? I think the answer is very clear. So we do have a lot of also very concrete interest that geographical proximity and cultural affinity will bring together. And this is why I think that the questions we should give up on Europe or not, is this an option? And from where I'm sitting, I think it's difficult to consider this a feasible option because we have too much together. And I don't think we'll go down that road.
Tal, regarding your remark about European fatigue from the peace process in a way and why it should get engaged, I think there could be different scenarios or different developments that will lead Europe to be back. Partly is a domestic motivation by some member states. There are some member states for which these topics are a priority domestically, and that leads them to action, not necessarily through the framework of the EU 28, but sometimes through different and smaller groupings. Then there are developments on the ground that happen and draw people or countries back into this topic, whether it's an American plan that needs to get some response, whether it's some security escalation on the ground, whether it's some steps taken by the next Israeli government towards annexation, partial annexation, and whether it's political changes within the Palestinian Authority whenever they will take place. So either of these developments happening, I think, will lead Europe to get re-engaged in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, even if it's not a top priority for it. And beyond that, the Israeli aspect for Europe is important not only because of that and bilateral aspect, it also relates to regional security issues in the Middle East, but recently also to developments within the Eastern Mediterranean and the new alignments happening within that space with European member states taking part, Cyprus, Greece, also Italy, and recently the attempt by the Americans in a way to step up their involvement in such forums, perhaps on expense of what was previously European involvement. So that's a foreign policy issue for Europe on how it relates to the Mediterranean area.
Only 2 points. I don't remember who said it, but someone asked this question about how the new right or the populist right can unite. And I think the ability of the new right to unite is very difficult because we perceive them as the same. But the truth is they are very, very different. Some examples, the Poles are very anti-Russians, while Salvini and Le Pen have some kind of a flirt with Putin. Orban is very opposed to Le Pen approach, Eurosceptic approach, especially in the issue of the common market. The Brexit Party is a different kind of animal. Nobody can really commit anything with that because you want only to live, not everything else with the European Union. So it's true that all the Eurosceptic parties or the new right or the far right look the same from far, but they are very, very different. And they are very, very unique in every country and what they want. The other point is about Israel, and I think there is some kind of a statement that floats in the room that Israel is drifting away or moving away from Europe. But what is more true in my eyes that Israel just want Europe give the same treatment to her that she gives Europe. For example, Israel don't determine the nature of its relations with Spain according to what happened in Catalonia in the demonstrations. It doesn't be any part of its politics. And the only parties in Europe that don't connect the Palestinian issue to Israel are the far right and the Eurosceptic and the new right parties. And in this regard, they're not only Israel is drifting away from Europe, Europe is drifting away from Israel because it wants this connection. Because it's not ability to differentiate between economic issue, diplomatic issue, and etc. And this is something very, very important to understand.
2 comments that I'm really going to try to keep short. this sentence, the far right did not achieve all of that was expected of it, has repeated itself, I think, in almost every European election I've followed in the last 5 years. Now, it is at the same time true and completely false, because more often than not, the numbers project a rise in support for that particular group, but the way that it is translated in the specific political system is that there's just a bigger group on the edges, and the center that actually holds power is becoming smaller and needs to find a way to get along with less people. So at the same time, we see a rise in support for these for nationalistic and particularistic ideas over globalization, but we do not see them translated into the political system. We are seeing it translated some places, like for instance Italy, but as a whole, that is it's a repeating occurrence. Now let's look at the axes that I mentioned earlier. If you look at the idea of more or less Europe, and I think Ambassador Giaufret was absolutely correct in saying that the Europeans have given up on Europe. Everybody is now committed to the framework of the European Union. It's just a question of what we do within it. So we have parties that would like less Europe. They would like Europe to exist, but maybe not tell them that Cadbury isn't chocolate. And parties that would like more Europe, and like Macron would like to tell everybody what they are and aren't allowed to buy and when. So on that scale of more or less Europe, everybody agrees that Europe is a good idea. And on the question of more or less Europe, more Europe won by 506 to everybody else. So it's a win by a very, very, very far margin, but it's becoming smaller. It was bigger in the previous election and bigger in the elections before that, and so on. If we look at the other axes, which is particularism versus universality, again, we see a win for the nationalist movement, but again, it is first of all, it's smaller to begin with. It's like 386 to everything else, and it is also becoming smaller. The differences on the grand European scale are smaller. The differences, again, within those groups. The most a noticeable difference is a moving away from existing political powers to new ones. It's a call, I guess, of European voters to do something different, to do something new. Problem is that it's not being translated into the political system, because more Europe actually won twice. It won first because it has a lot more support, but it also won because the EPP, which is a more Europe, more to the nationalistic side, and I'm saying that very, very carefully, it's just a way to move away from right and left party, is probably going to sit in a coalition with a more Europe, more universalistic view. So even though there are more nationalists in the European Parliament, they're not going to express that, because the EPP has made a choice that Europe is more important if you have to choose between those two axes. And so you have a growing group of people who are feeling that they are not being heard. That is a problem that anyone who's ever analyzed European Union, it's a problem that we follow. It just takes different manifestations, and this is the new manifestation. And we keep saying that the far right isn't winning, but the point is that what we're seeing is discontent. And that discontent is something that should be noted and addressed. It should be noted and addressed within the European system, and it should be noted and addressed within national systems, because it's not going away. It is something that will follow us through, and it was said, Omer, I think, said correctly. The idea is that they're communicating with each other because it's a group of groups that feels like its issues are not being heard, and listening, I guess, in a political system is important. And there's only so many times that you can say, yeah, but they didn't take power, before that becomes so frustrating that it is no longer the case.
I think that was a good conclusion of many things that were mentioned here. And I think one of at least two scholars that can summarize those trends, or at least identify those trends already more than 10 years ago, were Gary Marx and Lisbeth Huche, and they were writing about the post-functionalism wave of trying to explain this Euroscepticism, the sources, and how it actually breaks political parties and divides within the political parties and not between the right, left necessarily. And we see this really, really clearly in the United Kingdom, where the Labour and the Conservatives are split within them between the pro and anti-EU, and it happens also in other countries. So Europe has, I come back to my initial point, has politicized in a way that actually changes the political system within the member states. And we think we see this very clearly right now. How that may influence Israel, I'm not sure. We'll need to wait and see how this, the parliament actually reacts. And we should say also, and Ariel has mentioned that, actually, or maybe I should stress that the European Parliament is not a central player in the foreign policy of the European Union. It's not the External Action Service, it's not the High Representative or those bodies that do make the foreign policy of the European Union, the Council of Ministers of Foreign Affairs, obviously. But the Parliament can inflict harsh decisions, or maybe not decisions, resolutions or moves, or even questions, parliamentary questions with regards to Israel that would be very uneasy for Israel. But we have 5 years ahead of us to analyze that, and we'll see how it evolves in June and July. I want to thank you very much for your participation and to thank the participants for your comments. And I'm sorry I was kind of short, but I wanted to have also comments and debates among you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Maya.